of that provides the kind of the background to the fact that when the Hamas breakout took place on October 7th, first of all, Hamas had considerably more capabilities than most people had reckoned. Hamas and the community of Palestinians living in Gaza had a whole lot more resilience than most people outside had expected. And they have had huge support globally, as we have seen in the various discussions in the Security Council, where the United States has been forced to cast 3 vetoes now. The third one happened this week. And when it casts a veto, it has a terrible effect, of course, because there is no ceasefire. So the fighting continues. The women and children and men of Gaza continue in their, truly horrible situation, to die, being, starved and dislocated and killed by artillery and everything else. That is just the horrible price that is being paid. But when the US casts a veto, it also underlines the isolation of the US. In this last Security Council resolution discussion this week, nobody joined the US in opposing the ceasefire resolution. Even the United Kingdom abstained. So, you can just see the increasing isolation of the United States. Not sure how much more time I have. I just want to note that we've had 2 big things happening in international affairs regarding Gaza this week. One was that Security Council vote with the US veto. And on that occasion, Linda Thomas Greenfield, the US ambassador to the United Nations, uttered these unbelievable words, saying that what she is working on is a final solution. I mean, I have no idea where she came up with that, but it just sends shivers down my spine. And then we've also had this week, and continuing until next Monday, this impressive parade of high-ranking legal experts from 60 or 65 governments around the world giving their opinion on the legality of Israel's 57-year occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Starting off with the state of Palestine, delivering a 3-hour presentation, and then all the other presenters get to present a 30-minute presentation. On Wednesday, I think, we had the US acting legal advisor to the State Department, and he, like Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, said, oh, we can't opine on this. We can't have the ICJ enter into this whole matter because, there are important negotiations underway. So please don't, derail these important negotiations. We've been hearing this for 50 years from Washington, that, oh, we can't do anything decisive because there are negotiations. Anyway, this has to be negotiated between the parties, between the occupier and the occupied. It's complete flim-flam. And as many of my Palestinian friends say, the whole point of these American-sponsored so-called negotiations is to keep Palestinians occupied. And sadly, in the case of the PA, it has stayed occupied in this way. But the world is changing. And back in '56, when I was but a wee thing, Anthony Eden thought he could overthrow Egypt's President Nasser, along with France and Israel, and they launched the tripartite aggression. That was brought to an end on that occasion by President Eisenhower, who used purely economic levers in order to force the tripartite aggressors to end their aggression. That is what I'm hoping for now, that the rising economic powers will be able to use their economic leverage to force the United States and their Israeli allies to end this terrible situation.
Thank you so much for this, Helena, for placing all these events in this broader context. Building on what Helena said, Dr. Ghareeb, how does the context of October 7th and the ongoing genocide in Gaza relate to the geopolitical shifts described by Helena, particularly in relation to the war in Ukraine? And additionally, could you provide insights into the international response, especially from the global south, to the genocide in Gaza, and whether it reflects major changes in the global balance of power and also in the dynamics of the global order?
Thank you, Jihad. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for organizing this panel. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be both with Helena and Muin. Followed their work, read it for a long time. They're quite impressive, and it's an honor to be with them. To talk about what you were asking about, or the issues, I think one of the most important things that I think we have to remember is that as the war in Gaza seems to be closing its fifth month, or close to the fifth month now, many Arabs and others across the global south and even in the West have been struck both by the ferocity of Israel's military campaign and by major Western governments' unwavering support for what's going on in Gaza, the horrible things that we are seeing all on television, on social media. Although we had begun to see, I would say in the last couple of weeks, at least vis-a-vis the US, some changes in the language and the terminology. And we're beginning to see also some differences emerging between the Israeli government and the US government. But in reality, we have not seen any significant changes, as we saw that, and as Helena was mentioning, there has been no real change in a sense. There's been talk and basically no substance here. To many people in the region, basically they have come to see this war over the past few months, that it's not just simply Netanyahu's war and his right-wing government war, but it is also the war of President Biden and many people in his administration, although here also we're beginning to get a lot of criticism coming from within the administration itself, whether it's people within, diplomats within the State Department, people working, especially younger people working at the White House. We've also heard from people from the embassies in the Middle East and beyond, warning about the dangers of continuing this policy and its impact on future U.S. Role in the world and its interests, including some. There were leaks this past week of such messages coming in to the United States government and to the State Department about this issue. So this reflects that, in fact, there is widespread international support, as was reflected also in what Helen said about the vote at the Security Council recently and the vote at the General Assembly. The vote at the General Assembly, I think, was 153 people to 10, countries to 10. And then you had at the Security Council meeting, it was basically 13-1 with Britain abstaining and the US opposed. So this reflects, in fact, that we're seeing a lot of changes taking place on the international scene vis-a-vis this issue, vis-a-vis the US policies towards what's going on the ground and beyond. It's not just this, but because I think what the position that we are seeing now did not start with Gaza. We saw it actually with the start of the Ukrainian war and the response of many countries in the world, which the U.S. had hoped and expected would stand by it, basically stood either were neutral or some were critical, while some of them were critical also of the invasion by Russia of the Ukraine. Many of them believed that the U.S. and its allies were the ones who provoked this war. As a result of this, I think we are beginning to see some significant changes in terms of public opinion. First of all, there have been a number of polls that have been taken in the region, and part of it, I think, the results of these polls are coming as a result of both the changes that are taking place internationally, the re-emergence of Russia, the rise of China, the rise of also new powers such as Brazil, India, South Africa, which are playing a major role in their not only in their regions, but now on the international scene. Of course, we saw what South Africa did when it brought the issue before the International Court of Justice. It was the main country, the major country, which had played such a role, important role in this arena. And now we see many other countries supporting them. And this happened despite the pressure that was put over the South African government and the effort to they were actually warned and threatened that there would be sanctions, there would be consequences, and yet that did not change their position. But in terms of the polls, that's what I wanted to just touch on them briefly. We saw some very important polls that show, in fact, that the international public opinion is changing. It is reflecting increasing criticism of U.S. policies and the policies of the Western powers. And to a lesser extent, of course, even here I'm talking about the European Union. Russia and China appear to have been gaining support in basically we see it in the Middle East, we saw it in Africa, and in other parts of the world. There was actually a poll that was done by the BBC, which reflected that there was a decline in U.S. popularity in the Middle East. 57% of the people basically considered the United States now as a hostile power to people in the Arab world. 57% considered it that it was a hostile power, while 70% of the young people who were polled basically felt that it was hostile, and only 26% of the people said that considered the United States a friend. That's quite a change from earlier polls that were taken before. The Friedrich Ebert Institute, it is a prominent think tank connected to the Social Democrats in Germany, also had a poll which was, however, wider in the sense that they did the poll in 9 Arab countries plus Turkey, Iran, and Israel. This poll showed that in 5 countries, including the Emirates, Egypt, and Jordan, which are considered traditional allies or friends, very close friends of the United States, public opinion showed more trust in the Russian perspective than they did in the America and its views and policies. 7 countries considered the war in the Ukraine as a geopolitical struggle between Russia and the West, and not a war between 2 countries. 9 countries said that Washington was the main beneficiary of this war. All of these countries favored withdrawal. I'm not talking about Israel here, but the 7 Arab countries. The polls showed that they wanted withdrawal American withdrawal, military withdrawal from the Middle East. And they believed that if the US withdrew, this would make it much more safe, and it would even improve relations with the region between the United States and the Arab world and among the Arab countries themselves. And they also believed that the presence of Russia, the return of Russia, brings balance to world politics and to the international relations arena. And so these are very significant positions, in a sense, taken by or seen by the people, and they reflect changes that have taken place over the recent months and the recent, especially after the recent events in Gaza. One of the other things that I think is also very important is that, and this is what you hinted at, I believe, Jihad, and you were asking, is that the war and the regional reaction to it is threatening actually to expansion beyond Gaza, beyond the clashes that are taking place in the West Bank, and also what the settlers are doing in the West Bank, and also on the border between Lebanon and Israel. We've seen the attacks from Iran. There's been a obvious increase of the attacks from Iraqi militias. Some of these militias are part of the Iraqi military and security forces against Israel. This increase occurred after the events of October 7 and Israel's attack against Gaza. The reaction in Iraq has led to this increase in attacks. The same thing has also happened in Syria. We began to see more attacks in Syria by what, of course, here we describe as, or has been described as, militias, pro-Iran militias, or militias supported and trained, financed by Iran. In addition to this, I think the danger and the real surprise came from Yemen, came from the Houthis. This was not expected by, I didn't hear from anyone here that I know, I didn't read anything that the attack from Yemen and the Houthis was expected. And Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, and it's been going wars. And so nobody seemed to expect that they were going to be able to do anything or would do anything. And in fact, they have played a very important role in affecting what we saw the US and Britain sending forces very quickly, trying to establish an alliance that would send naval forces to the region. And it was not as successful as Washington had hoped. But this is, I think, very important. The danger is that if the United States does not put pressure on Israel and to stop this genocide that's taking place, people of Gaza don't have water, don't have medicine, don't have food. The hospitals are being destroyed. Historic sites, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world was hit. One of the oldest historical mosques, and yesterday another mosque was destroyed. But an very old mosque was also struck. The attack at the Shifa hospital, doctors were being killed, journalists, and we're hearing very little even from the American media about what's happening to the journalists, because it appears that those journalists are being targeted to prevent them from doing their job and covering the story. And so these are just some of the points, and this is the danger. The danger is of a much wider explosion, which is likely to draw in other players. I heard yesterday, read an article that said, I'm not sure yet how accurate it is, but that the Russians have moved some of their forces, their air force, to the border over the Golan Heights, which has not been there before. And that is, if it's true, this is a significant development. Anyway, let me stop here. I think I've gone over my allotted time. Thank you.
No, this has been really helpful, Dr. Ghareeb. Thank you so much. And since you talked about the possibility of a broader regional escalation, I mean, we're hearing statements from Israeli officials all the time that you know, a war against Lebanon is a possibility. But this is the same Israeli military that declared back in October that the goal of its military campaign in Gaza is to eliminate Hamas, destroy and uproot the Palestinian armed factions. And Muin has been writing extensively about the details of Israel's performance and whether it's actually meeting any of its promises to itself and to its allies, especially in terms of its tactical and strategic progress on the ground. And we're already in late February, and from a strategic and tactical and military point of view, it doesn't seem that Israel has accomplished so much. And many are reading Israel's performance on the ground as some sort of a setback, given the big promises and claims Israel made in the beginning of the war. So my question for you, Muin, and it somewhat relates to the context of what Helena and Dr. Ghareeb have talked about, considering these setbacks and Israel's inability to achieve its goals on the ground, as part of this campaign it's launched against Palestinians in Gaza. Could you elaborate on the evolving position of Israel within the framework of Western imperial strategy? Specifically, how do these military setbacks or challenges or Israel's inability to achieve victory affect Israel's standing as a strategic ally within the broader geopolitical ambitions of Western powers?
Thank you very much, Jihad, to you and to the Jerusalem Fund for organizing this. And it's a real pleasure to be here also with my two fellow panelists. I think I'd like to start by answering your question by examining the roots of Israel's strategic relationship with its Western sponsors and allies. You know, we're often told about shared democratic values, about restitution for the Holocaust, and so on. And I think this is kind of the cosmetic cover, if you will, that in a way, deliberately or otherwise, conceals the core of the strategic relationship between Israel and the West. I think the late Professor Ibrahim of Georgetown University put it extremely well in an essay that he wrote in the early 1980s, where he examined the Balfour Declaration and asked, you know, why did Britain choose to support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine? And he reached, I thought, a very persuasive conclusion that Britain's primary interest was in defending its continued control of the Suez Canal, which at the time was the jugular vein of the British Empire, and that by implanting this foreign minority in a hostile environment, it would ensure its continued loyalty and dependence on Great Britain for its survival and so on. And this was the idea that the Jewish national home, later the Jewish state, would serve as an outpost for Western interests in the Middle East, was something that was also very much amplified by Zionist leaders from the very outset. It was Herzl, I believe, who referred to a Jewish state in Palestine as an outpost of civilization against barbarism. More recently, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak referred to Israel as the villa in the jungle. Maybe a better way to put it would be to say the genocidal villa in the region. But the point is that there's an understanding by both Israel and its Western sponsors that Israel is the guarantor of Western interests and influence in the Middle East, and that Israel serves as an outpost of Western interests and influence in the Middle East, and that Israel will do the West's dirty work for it, much as you have done by other proxies, whether in the region or in other regions of the world. So the question now becomes, if we look at the current war of Israel's war against the Gaza Strip, how will that affect this relationship? How will that affect the perception of Israel as a reliable proxy for Western interests in the Middle East? I mean, I think Helena referred to the 1956 Suez Crisis, where in collusion with Britain and France, the Israeli military basically marched through the Gaza Strip and across the Sinai Peninsula, up to and including the Suez Canal. I believe it was in the space of 48 or 72 hours. In 1967, Israel once again demonstrated its value to the West by defeating the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian, and for that matter, the Iraqi armed forces in the space of several days. It's called the Six-Day War for a reason. And then we began to see a slight change in 1973, 1982, and then in recent decades, Israel has proven increasingly incapable of reaching a decisive and definitive outcome in its conflicts with those it occupies and its neighbors. I think one big turning point was the Kuwait crisis of 1990, 1991, where Israel, rather than serving as a proxy for U.S. interests, had to be begged by the Americans and the British not to get involved and not to respond to Iraqi missile attacks on Israel, because if it would do so, there was a fear that it would jeopardize the regional and international coalition that the U.S. had constructed. So I want to now fast forward to the current war. And the argument I would make is that even if it were to end tomorrow morning, with Israel having decisively achieved all its objectives in the next 24 hours, let's assume that for the sake of argument, Israel would still have a lot to answer for, because certain things have happened since October 7th that I think raise serious questions about Israel's continued reliability as an effective proxy for Western imperial strategy in the Middle East. Now you go back to October 7th, and you have what is ultimately a second order militia, Hamas. And remember, we're talking about Hamas. We're not talking about Hezbollah or the Tamil Tigers. Being able to conquer a territory within Israel for the first time since 1949, within Israel, that was larger than the Gaza Strip itself. Then you have a period of 5 months where Israel has proven incapable of achieving any of its key military objectives vis-a-vis either Hamas or the other Palestinian armed movements in the Gaza Strip. Yes, I completely agree. Israel had other strategic objectives, seeking the ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, razing the Gaza Strip to the ground, making it unfit for human habitation, and so on. And in that, it succeeded, but that is not of particular value to Israel's Western sponsors. What Israel's Western sponsors and allies want to see is not only a military that is an effective killing machine, but also a military that is an effective fighting force that can take on a militia like Hamas and rapidly deal decisive and definitive defeat upon such a group. That is something it has proven entirely incapable of doing. And even if it were to achieve that tomorrow morning, I would argue it's already too late. I mean, you need almost half a year to take care of a second-order militia in a postage stamp-sized territory of 365 square kilometers. It just doesn't project the aura of invincibility that the Israelis have always been so keen to project about themselves. Second issue, Lebanon. Almost immediately after October 7th, Washington's main concern was that Israel not prematurely launch a ground operation in the Gaza Strip because they saw the chaos and disarray at the leadership level of Israel, but also that Israel not open a second front against Hezbollah in Lebanon, because American planners and military specialists came to the conclusion that Israel was simply incapable of doing so. And rather than Israel being able to deal with its Hezbollah problem on the northern border, the US had to send not one, but two aircraft carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean to deter Hezbollah in case Hezbollah had thought of doing anything similar. And I found this particularly symbolic because for those old enough to remember how Americans used to talk about Israel in the 1980s, it was former Secretary of State Alexander Haig, I believe, who referred to Israel as the stationary American aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. In other words, they're doing our work for us, so we don't have to send our aircraft carriers there to do it ourselves. Well, look what happened in October. The US not only discovered that this stationary aircraft carrier is actually a fairly leaky fishing trawler, but it had to send not one, but two of its own aircraft carriers to defend Israel. So rather than Israel being the outpost of Western interests in this region, the US had to come in not to defend US interests, but to defend Israel. Then I think what's happening in the Red Sea is of particular significance here, because this is affecting the entire global economy. It has effectively shut down or reduced by 50% the ability of the position of the Suez Canal and the flow of global maritime trade through, which is having all kinds of knock-on effects on global supply chains and so on. Well, this is all happening in response to Israel's genocidal onslaught against the Gaza Strip. Is Israel able to solve this problem so that its shipping can continue to freely access the Red Sea port of Eilat? No. Is Israel able to solve this problem so that trade and Western shipping and so on can continue to freely access the Red Sea and the Suez Canal? No. What you've had instead is an international flotilla consisting of US and UK navies, now launching all these bombing raids on Yemen, failing, but at least trying to keep the Red Sea and Suez Canal open, which have been threatened only because of Israel's war in the Gaza Strip. In other words, Israel is quite literally a strategic burden on Western interests rather than a strategic asset. And the same holds true for what we're seeing in Syria and Iraq. There were no, or virtually no, attacks on US military bases in Syria and Iraq after Trump left office and before the current fighting started. But now, again, who is seeking to defend these? It's not Israel. It's the Americans having to defend not only Israel, but having to defend themselves because of Israel. And so, by way of conclusion, I don't think this will have any immediate impact in terms of Western and particularly American perceptions of Israel and its value in U.S. Perceptions, because I think part of the issue here is that for many of these Western leaders, it's not an issue of them putting Israeli interests ahead of American ones. Quite the contrary. The issue is that they do not distinguish between Israel and the United States, between American interests and Israeli interests. From their point of view, what is good for Israel is good for the United States, and what is bad for Israel reflects poorly on the United States geopolitically. But over the longer term, I think, people will start asking questions. What kind of a proxy is this? That rather than projecting our interests and promoting our interests, we have to send our Navy over. We have to send over, tens of thousands of tons of weapons that were intended for Ukraine, and so on. And I think if and when these questions do get asked, and they're seriously discussed, and people begin reflecting on them, Israel will begin to lose, at least partially, I think, its most valuable strategic asset, which has nothing to do with, shared values and all the rest of it. But it's all about the perception that Israel is a reliable projection of Western interests in the Middle East. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muin, for this really, great, great answer that really captures a lot of the thoughts and ideas that many of us have been sharing recently. And for me, this, I would like to go back to October 6th and October 5th. And I invite all panelists to weigh in on the next question, so please feel free to jump in. Before October 7th, many analysts observed that while the United States was shifting its focus to Asia Pacific and China and Taiwan, and there is a question about Taiwan in the Q&A, it sought to push for Arab-Israeli normalization with the Abraham Accords, and later on with the push for Israeli-Saudi normalization as a way to create a coalition in the region that would continue to maintain U.S. interests while the United States is focused elsewhere, especially in Ukraine and Asia Pacific, as I said earlier. Can we say that this has been disrupted by the events of October 7th and the different dynamics, shifts of the global and regional dynamics that all of you have described, and also in light of Israel's inability to achieve decisive victory in Gaza?
Well, I could take on some of that. Definitely. In the introduction to my Boston Review piece, I note that prior to October 7th, Jake Sullivan, who I have to say is not, the sharpest pencil in the box, but he's the national security advisor for President Biden. He had published this article in Foreign Affairs in which he said basically, the Arab-Israeli theater has been resolved. We're on our way to the Abraham Accords, including Saudi Arabia. Now we can shift attention to the Asia Pacific theater. And so then, you know, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the American-led coalition in the Red Sea, which they call Operation Prosperity Guardian, although some people call it Operation Protect Genocide. But anyway, it should be noted that they have failed majorly in winning enrollment in this coalition. You know, the only active participants in it, in addition to the US Navy, are the British Navy and the French Navy. There are some, you know, naval attaches from, you know, Seychelles or Hither or Yon.
Based in Bahrain.
Yeah, that's right, which is propped up by the US Fifth Navy, let us remember. Important to note that some European countries have stood aside from standing with the United States on Gaza completely or nearly completely, including Ireland and Spain. So that is, I think it's worth noting and appreciating. But they certainly, you know, I guess at the beginning, the American Navy said, oh, you know, Spain is going to be part of this Operation Prosperity Guardian. And the Spanish said, oh, no, not us, not us. You know, we're not going nowhere near it. So by early January, mid-January, the US was getting into real trouble because the Houthis said, okay, you know, we're going to block any shipping that is linked to Israel. But now that the Americans and Brits have attacked us, we will also block any shipping that is, you know, linked to the United States or to Britain. And actually what's been happening is that Chinese and other major shipping lines are signaling to the Houthis in advance, you know, we have no links with Israel. This is an all Chinese crew. We are not headed for Israeli ports. And the Houthis are letting them through. You know, that's worth noting. It's not a complete blockade. The other thing is that, of course, the Houthis have said from the beginning that this is linked to the ceasefire. This is not just a random act of, you know, let's set up a checkpoint and do this. They've said, you know, so long as there is not a ceasefire, we will do this. And it is to, you know, to help to oppose, which every single government in the world is obligated to oppose genocide. And the Houthis are the ones who are most robust in doing that. So anyway, in mid-January or so, the Americans were getting very upset that, you know, their attacks against the Houthis weren't actually achieving very much. So Jake Sullivan takes off and goes to a meeting in Bali with the leading Chinese foreign policy guru, Wang Yi, and begs him for China's help in persuading the Houthis not to do this. And, you know, Wang Yi just kind of looked at him and said, no. So actually, this is a very new thing that's happening in the West Asian region, that Chinese influence is much larger than it has been at any time since the 1430s. I won't go into the whole history of what happened in the 1430s, but it's really interesting. If you go and look at that, there was a Chinese admiral called Zheng He who was of Muslim origin, and anyway, very interesting. So basically, the Chinese have succeeded largely in flipping Saudi Arabia from, it was always kind of a US protectorate, and now it is determinedly in the neutral camp. And another very important thing about Operation Prosperity Guardian is that the two big countries that have, you know, also been attacking the Houthis very, very violently since 2015, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I mean, that is a terrible civil war that we should underline, you know, how the terrible suffering of the people of Yemen. The Saudis and the Emiratis refused to join. the US naval coalition. So, you know, something big has changed in the region, and China is a part of it, and the crumbling of the US hegemony, the US empire, is another part of it. So, you know, it's really great to have this discussion right now.
If I may just add something, I agree with everything that Helena said. I think this is a reflection of the changes that are taking place internationally and regionally. I mean, when there was the problem between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the country that brought the two together was China. For the Saudis are now teaching Chinese in some of their schools. And that, I think, in itself, it says a great deal. But I think what's more significant, more interesting in a way about what's been going on is that the administration has always been pushing for this idea that the Trump administration basically was created or was behind the idea of these Abrahamic Accords, this agreement. Well, the Saudis have made it clear that they are not going to normalize relation with Israel unless there is a Palestinian state composed of Gaza and the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. The Saudis say that this is the Arab position, this is the Saudi position, and they are not going to change from that. Part of that also, there was a poll that was taken recently. It showed that something like 90% of the Saudis basically were opposed to any kind of normalization unless there is a recognition of the Palestinian state. I mean, this is, and yet, despite all of this, we're still hearing from people, U.S. officials who are going to the region saying that this is what they are working on. This is what they are trying to achieve. So I'm not so sure how. This is, I think, a very, very interesting point to raise, because it raises a question I think also both Muin and Helena touched upon, was the quality of of leadership in a way. It seems one thing we have been seeing in the last couple of decades or decade and a half, that the U.S. as a very well-known American diplomat, former ambassador, I think he was also the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Chaz Freeman, who is a very well-known and respected ambassador. He has said, it seems that we have given up on diplomacy. We no longer use diplomacy. We use either sanctions or the threat of sanctions. We use force or the threat of force. And basically, so the U.S. seems to have lost something very important, the use of its soft power. And it's America's soft power was one of its major assets in the world, because people love American music, they love American movies, they love American culture, they love even American food, although now there are boycotts of Starbucks and McDonald's in Paris. That they showed the other day on the BBC that the stores have been empty. The owners came out and they said, we have not been getting any people in. So, but the point that I was trying to make here is that that there have been changes, but part of the problem is that the way the administration has been dealing with those, for example, when tried to pressure African countries. They only decided to hold a summit for African American summit after there was a very successful summit held between Putin and the African leaders. Over 45 leaders, I think, out of 54 in Africa attended that conference. They were very close. The Russians gave them something like during they provided free, I think, vaccines during COVID. I mean, these are things, that's why maybe we saw people in the streets of Niger holding the Russian flag, raising the Russian flag during the recent crisis there. There was a story of one tailor who was asked to make 70 Russian flags because people wanted to carry them in a demonstration. That shows that, in fact, the Russians were, by sending 12 million tons free of charge of grains to Africa, poor African countries, very poor African countries, actually is not forgotten about. So the U.S. could do a great deal, for example, in this area, which has not been done. And I think the fact that the stick alone is not the best method to deal with other countries. So there was the last point, which might be I saw a debate that took place between Dov Zakheim, who was the number 3 in the Defense Department, with an Indian senior official. I think he may have been Assistant Secretary of State they were debating in England over what what's going on in the world and Ukraine. And after a while, Zakheim said to him, India should be ashamed of itself. So the Indians seemed to have been stunned a little bit. Said, what did India do? Why should we be ashamed of it? He said, you are buying weapons from Russia. You are buying oil from Russia. How could India, a democratic country, be doing that? The Indians said to him, this is your war, not our war. So you take care of it yourself. We deal with our other countries and what's in India's best interest, not in anybody else's best interest. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Ghareeb. Muin, do you have something to say about this, or should we?
Well, just briefly, if there is a U.S. pivot to Asia, I haven't noticed. I mean, the U.S. got kicked out of Iraq, got kicked out of Afghanistan. That's all true, but that wasn't particularly by choice. And then let's not forget, if there is a pivot to Asia and growing rivalry with China, well, where does China get all its oil? It gets it from the Arabian Peninsula. That's its main source of hydrocarbons. Europe gets very much of its natural gas from the same region. So the idea that the U.S. is going to abandon its efforts at maintaining hegemony of the Middle East, as if the U.S. has to make a choice between the Middle East and East Asia, doesn't strike me as credible. And if I recall correctly, this pivot to Asia started under Obama. Well, Obama was deeply involved in the Yemen war, was deeply involved in Libya, was also involved in Syria and so on. So it may be a nice slogan for think tank types, but the evidence for it doesn't exist.
Okay, and related to that, and I would like to switch to some of the questions we have, especially for you, Muin, because I know that you have to run to do another podcast. There is a question from Nusayba who thanks you, and then says that sounds like the message to uplift here is, quote, Israel is bad for U.S. security, bad for business, and bad for U.S. interests in the Middle East, end quote. Is that right? And if so, would you say is the main target for this messaging, as we are having no luck with the current administration and Congress? And this kind of relates to, you know, how difficult it's been for advocates to push the Biden administration on a moral and humanitarian grounds. So is this something that, is this conviction something that might become a realization in DC at some point?
Certainly not over the shorter term. And as you point out, I mean, the U.S. government may be elected, but U.S. governments traditionally are not responsive to public opinion. I mean, the politicians are bought and paid for by the plutocrats. And sure, there's elections and people are elected and so on. But the idea that this is a political system where the people make all the large decisions is a bit of a fiction, I think. Certainly, if you compare it to Europe, where you have often multi-party systems composed of coalitions, and where the margins between victory and loss tend to be narrower, and consequently, political leaders tend to be more responsive to public opinion. But even there, I think there's a growing chasm between the political class and the broader public. But as far as the question is concerned, I think the point I was trying to make is that Israel is demonstrating itself to be an increasingly ineffective guardian of Western interests in the Middle East. I think particularly with the current generation of US politicians who really have gone off the deep end. To them, it's really about the fulfillment of God's promise, and these are people who are now seeking to define a frozen embryo as a child, for God's sake. So the idea of any rational dialogue with these people is just out of the question. Rather, I think that and this I think has less to do with public opinion. I think it's more that people whose job it is to look seriously at these things, people in the Pentagon, people in the intelligence services and so on, will, I think, over time become less enamored of their Israeli counterparts who have, I think, quite successfully projected this image of omnipotence, of omniscience, of being able to do anything on behalf of anybody. And over the longer term, I think this will be a very significant strategic challenge for Israel. But I don't see it as a particularly effective talking point. I'm sorry to say, but if you look at the U.S. political system, it really is the inmates having taken over the asylum.
Helena, do you have
I am an inmate here in the asylum. And I would put things a little bit differently. I'm always really wary of appeals to American national interest, because that's not what I want to uphold. I want to uphold the rights of all, humankind. I want to dismantle the levers that the US and other Western countries use to control the rest of humankind. I want to dismantle the US military. I want to dismantle the sanctions regimes, which are referred to, by the way, US sanctions. They've become so normalized in this country, like, Putin killed Navalny, we'll slap on more sanctions. Biden has already sanctioned Russia as much as he can, and it's proven actually completely counterproductive. As I mentioned earlier, the US has sanctioned itself into a box, but the discourse on sanctions in this country has been completely normalized. Like, that's just a normal thing that countries should do. It's not at all. I mean, the United Nations itself refers to US sanctions. Okay, there are sanctions that the UN imposes, and there are sanctions that individual governments impose. When individual governments impose sanctions, these are referred to by the United Nations as coercive economic measures. It's bullying of the worst kind, but it's become completely normalized, against Venezuela, against Iraq, against Iran, against Libya, let's do it. No, we should dismantle this whole machinery of global control, primarily the military machinery, if you look at these budgets, sending weapons and goodness only knows what kind of horrendous things to Ukraine and to Israel, we know what they do. We know what those weapons do. That money needs to be spent preferably globally on health, education, and welfare, including in our neighboring countries in Central America. But even here at home, we have horrible needs. You walk down to the State Department, you see homeless people in tent camps right outside the State Department, and it has become normalized. Oh, that's how America is. America doesn't have to be like this. That's why I'm very wary of these appeals to national interests. Sorry.
Can I just briefly respond? I completely agree with Helena that any campaign should be based on basic principles rather than appeals of, you can achieve your imperial interests better if you ditch Israel. It shouldn't be able to achieve its imperial interests better with or without Israel. Rather, I was responding, I thought, to a different question, but I just wanted to clarify that I completely agree with Helena.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think the question comes from a place of frustration with the lack of responsiveness on the part of U.S. policymakers who sometimes appear to be acting against their very interests. But as Muin mentioned, sometimes there are people who are very difficult to have a rational and a reasonable conversation with. I'm going to continue to address more questions from the audience. And again, Muin, I know that you have to go soon, so please feel free to stick around for as long as you want, and we will hopefully conclude at 1:30 Eastern. The next question is from Muhammad, who asks whether the West takes the ICJ seriously, especially if countries like the United States and the United Kingdom are being threatened for being complicit in the genocide, and will this have an impact on the peace process or the political process? And I would like to add to that whether the current cynicism with regards to the ICJ and the broader rules order signify the crumbling of this very post-Second World War international order as we knew it, in light of what's happening in Gaza.
Let me try to take that. There's no doubt that there are double standards when it comes to the rules-based order to international law. When it comes to friends of the United States and countries that are considered as hostile or enemies or opponents of the United States. We have been hearing a great deal. Of course, I think what you mentioned, what you said, jihad is very true. I mean, this international order, to a large extent, was established by the United States. The laws, the rules, the establishment of the United Nations, and establishment of the Monetary Fund, the World Bank. All the U.S. played a major role in establishing the United Nations and finances it to a large extent, and that's why it has a lot of influence over it also. But things seem to have changed. I remember that when there were people who were asking, this goes back way back. For example, during immediately after the First World War, people in the Middle East wanted to have independence at that time, but the British and the French wanted to have mandatory powers over them. And well, they wanted to stay there and replace the Ottomans. And so did the Italians, actually, as well. And so what President Wilson at that time decided to send a mission to the region, and basically they found out to find out what is it that the people want. That was known as the King Crane Commission. And they were sent to the region. They met with journalists, with professors, academics, teachers, religious leaders, tribal leaders. Most of the people told them they wanted to have independence, but they said, look, it looks like it's the British or the French who are going to be ruling. Which ones do you prefer among? They said, we don't want either. If we have to live under mandate, we want the United States to be the mandatory power. That said something about what people at that time thought of the United States. President Penrose of the American University of Beirut wrote an article for the Reader's Digest in 1956. At that time, he wrote an article how, except for the Palestinian question, and where there's a great deal of criticism of what the U.S. position was, he said still most people in the Middle East favored the United States. They looked up to the United States. They admired Americans. They appreciated what Americans did, for example, where they built hospitals. This is what Helena was talking about. When they built hospitals, they built schools, universities, colleges. They established one of the first schools for women in the Middle East, actually. And people appreciated that. But things have changed dramatically. And it seems that the United States decided after the war to even to push some of its friends out, but not to allow the countries to develop and make their own decisions, but to become the new hegemon. And but up until that time, the U.S. seemed to be adopting a more balanced position. For example, we saw what President Eisenhower did. Maybe part of it was also national interest, but in reality, President Eisenhower, when the French, the British and Israelis invaded Egypt, the Israelis didn't want to leave, neither did the British nor the French. And President Eisenhower told them that they better get out. Well, of course, we also heard from the Soviets at that time. And he told the Israelis that you better get out, otherwise no more aid from the United States. And he was going to tax contributions that went to Israel. So that shows the difference, for example, in with the changes that have taken place to a certain extent in the way the U.S. is dealing with this issue. And talking about just one last point, we go back, there was an article either last week, I think it was last week, written by Ambassador Patrick Theros, who is an American ambassador, well-known, respected. He said, I wonder who's running the show in Washington. Was it basically Netanyahu or Biden? I'll stop.
Thank you, Dr. Ghareeb. Helena or Muin, do you have anything that you'd like to add on the topic of the ICJ?
Oh, I would love to, but there's so much to say. We have the two cases, of course. The one that we discussed at the Jerusalem Fund a couple of weeks ago with your guest Ahmed Abu Ful, which is the South Africa versus Israel case about genocide. And we're going to have the Israelis first required report back under those requirements coming within, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks. So that'll be something to look for.
I think it's due in 3 days on the 26th.
Oh, great. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Muin. Yeah, so let's see how that goes. But at that point, the court can make further orders regarding ending the plausible genocide there. And then now we have the latest case, which opened on Monday, which is the broader advisory opinion for the UN General Assembly on the issue of the legality of the entirety of the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and of Gaza. And to me, just listening and reading the submissions there, it's been notable to see, as I mentioned earlier, the terrible submission by the American lawyer representing the State Department. Another really interesting one was the Chinese submission, which was very, I want to say, hard line, that obviously the occupations have no lasting legitimacy and need to be ended. And I think that also applies to the occupation of Golan. Just going back to the question of US policy, worth noting and remembering that it was Trump who gave recognition to Israel's annexation of Golan and East Jerusalem, Greater East Jerusalem, that is, encompassing a whole chunk of the West Bank. When Biden came in January of 2021, he could have rescinded that recognition of those occupations on day one, and he chose not to, and he still has not rescinded those recognitions of those two occupations. To me, that renders him and his administration completely illegitimate as as the body which can broker Arab-Israeli peace,
Yeah, in fact, the Biden administration has not reversed a single one of the Trump administration's policy decisions on the Middle East, whether it's Western Sahara, whether it's East Jerusalem, whether it's the Golan Heights,
the JCPOA.
Yes, exactly. And the reclassification of illegal Israeli settlements as consistent with international law or whatever. The only change that was made was that the Biden administration, also the closure of the PLO representative office and expulsion of its diplomats, that was not resolved. The closure of the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem, that was not reversed. And on and on and on. So I think, in fairness, we should be talking about the Trump-Biden Palestine policy. The only thing that was changed was that the U.S. resumed the funding of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. That also didn't last long. The question is whether the West takes the ICJ seriously. My answer would be yes and no. It takes it very seriously when it issues rulings against enemies and adversaries. When it does that, its rulings are sacred, must be immediately implemented without any deviation whatsoever. One is either with international law or with the law of the jungle. But when its rulings are inconvenient for friends and allies, then all of a sudden it becomes a dispensable organization, but not without punishment, because it was literally within hours of the ICJ ruling on the 26th of January that South Africa had indeed presented a plausible case that Israel is perpetrating genocide in the Gaza Strip, that multiple governments, all of them, of course, Israel's Western sponsors and allies, immediately severed their funding of UNRWA. And I think the message was indisputably clear. You think international law applies to us as well? Okay, enjoy your famine. The idea that this was made on a serious basis is absurd. No evidence was presented. Many of these governments took note of the accusations against UNRWA through press reports. And the idea that a serious policy decision is made on the basis of a newspaper article, I think defies imagination. It was quite clearly a policy decision to punish the Palestinians in response for South Africa having the temerity to accuse their proxy, Israel, of committing genocide and of doing so successfully. And I think another indication that the West does take the ICJ seriously is this week, where one Western government after the other, they've been literally falling over themselves, making presentations to the court with regard to the other case that Helena mentioned, which is the international community through the UN General Assembly has asked the International Court of Justice to render a so-called advisory opinion on the status of Israeli rule over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in East Jerusalem. The basic question being, is Israel's status, is the status of these territories that of a military occupation? Because whatever one may think of military occupation is a recognized status under international law. Military occupation is not by definition illegal. Military occupation is by definition temporary and transitional. And so the question the international community put to the court is, does this indeed still constitute a military occupation? Or has it in fact become a different beast that can no longer, as a result of which the Israeli rule over these territories can no longer be considered legal? And, the US, the UK, Israel's other Western sponsors have been falling over themselves, rushing to The Hague to basically tell the court that it should ignore the international community and not render a response, not provide a response to the question that has been put for it. And therefore, I do think, people are often dismissive of the term international community. I think it's a term we should take seriously, but we also, I think, need to observe a distinction between the international community on the one hand and the West on the other, because we're increasingly finding that these are two terms that stand in contradiction to each other. These governments basically telling the court that it should not answer the question, should basically ignore the international community and not render an advisory opinion, which it has explicitly been asked to do by the UN General Assembly. And the kind of reasoning they're coming up with is just absurd. These things need to be negotiated. Well, good morning. You have been in charge of their negotiations for several decades, and it's because of your hegemony over the negotiations that absolutely nothing has happened, is happening, or ever will happen. And so, just to get back to the question, yes, I do think the West takes the court seriously, very seriously when it comes to rulings against enemies and adversaries, and sufficiently seriously when rulings don't go their way, that they put quite a bit of effort into ensuring its rulings are marginalized and ignored. And on that note, I'd like to once again thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Muin.
Great to have you with us, Muin.
Really appreciate you joining us before another podcast. So thank you so
Forward
much.
to it. Thank you. Goodbye.
Here, thank you. Helena and Dr. Ghareeb, do you have a moment for one or two more questions?
Yeah, just
Sure.
quickly.
Okay. So let's look at the questions here. Because we have plenty of questions and I really feel bad not to address all of them, or at least some of them. There is a question on the possibility of change in US foreign policy. I know we addressed that. It's from Nuruddin Ghanem from TRT World, who asks, could there be a change in the US foreign policy with or without Biden, given how ineffective and a burden Israel has become?
Edmund, do you want to take this?
I think it's very difficult to see that. And I think Biden finds himself in a very difficult spot. He's under pressure now internally from a variety of groups and human rights organizations have come out asking for a ceasefire. Labor unions. The head of the auto workers union came from Michigan and to participate in a demonstration in front of the White House. And he said, we didn't know very much about the Palestinian-Israeli issue. He said, we were against the fascists during the Second World War. We were against the apartheid regime. We supported the civil rights movement. We were against the war in Vietnam, but we didn't know much about. But now we do know a little more, and we support this. So you have a number of unions. You have a couple of weeks ago, 1,000 African American ministers who came out to criticize President Biden. Clearly, they said he's lost his way, and that if he does not change his view, there are a lot of people of their followers who are not going to vote for him. These people have about 15 million followers. That is very significant indication. We hear Jewish Americans participated in demonstrations in front of the White House at Capitol Hill. And yet, despite all of this, we didn't hear anything. These did not change. We hear the whole world, in a sense, asking for an end to the massacres that are taking place in Gaza on an hourly basis, in a way. And yet, the president has not changed his mind. We have begun to see some slight changes. For example, we said there have been reports that he used very, words that you don't say in polite company against Netanyahu. He also earlier, which is surprising, the support that earlier he did not want to invite Netanyahu to come to the White House, and he invited instead the president of Israel, and he met Netanyahu when he went at the United Nations during the General Assembly meetings. Now they are saying, of course, they cannot go to Gaza, and that Gaza is not going to be annexed by Israel. These are changes, but they are very minor changes. He's not yet willing to say, stop the war. He can do that because Israel relies on the United States for its financially. It relies on the United States to give it political protection and to basically defend Israel. And yet he has refused to do anything about that. He may regret this, I think, down the road, but because I think more and more people, his poll numbers are really down. He's lost the support of over 20% of the African Americans. He's lost support among the Latinos, among the Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, even Asian Americans. We began to see some of them. There were in the demonstrations that took place. So you have all of this. This shows that public opinion in the United States is also changing. But at the same time, he also knows that he needs the support of some of the friends of Israel in the United States who have financial support to help his campaign, to help the campaign of the Democratic who support him, and who make it very difficult for those who oppose them. And so he is in a very difficult spot. That's why I think he is under. It's difficult for him to make a decision. I mean, I would be surprised. I have to wait and see, that his words are translated to actions before saying that he is likely to change his views.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghareeb. Helena, I'm going to conclude the event unless you'd like to add anything.
Just to note, I agree with everything that Edmund said, but, earlier this week, Biden went to a big fundraiser at the home of Haim Saban in Los Angeles. You know, Haim Saban is a very wealthy Democratic Party donor who is an Israeli American. And, you know, that's how the influence gets brought to bear on the president. You're not allowed to write much about this in the corporate media here in the United States, but if you go to Haaretz, they had a wonderful investigative piece recently about the role of big Jewish donors in this country and their effect on the election. So yes, at the grassroots, there's been a massive change. I first came to this country in 1982 when the Israelis, Begin and Sharon, were bombing the hell out of Beirut, and all my friends in Beirut. And, you know, people in this country, by and large, like 98%, were supporting the Israeli attack against the PLO in Beirut. Even Jane Fonda, you know, Hanoi Jane, was up there, like, entertaining the Israeli troops. I think her husband, Tom Hayden, was running for Congress at the time, something like that. So at the grassroots and in the general culture, things have changed a lot. But as Muin mentioned earlier, that doesn't have much effect yet on the political echelon. I want to give a shout out to all the amazing young Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans, Jewish Americans who have really been spearheading the change. And I think that the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center has a huge role to play in providing, you know, additional resources, intellectual resources for all these new movements.
Thank you so much, Helena. And as we conclude today's webinar, Gaza at the Hinge of History, I want to express my deepest appreciation to Helena Cobban, Dr. Edmund Ghareeb, and Muin Rabbani for their invaluable insights, and to all of you for participating and contributing to this important conversation. Today's discussion has highlighted the complex dynamics of the events of October 7th and the ensuing genocide in Gaza and their global and regional implications. Let us move forward with the knowledge shared here and commit to push for an end of the genocide and of the aggression and of the bloodshed. And remember that this is still ongoing, that people are being killed. More than 100 Palestinians are being killed every day in Gaza. These are our relatives, friends, neighbors, people who are just being killed just for who they are, and this shame has to come to an end. Thank you for joining us, and please stay engaged with the Palestine Center and Just World Educational for future events. And if you haven't read Gaza Writes Back, a book that was co-edited by my dear teacher and mentor, Professor Rifat Al-Arair, who was killed by Israel in December last year, please do, and check out Just World Books for on how to get a copy of the book. Dr. Ghareeb and Helena, thank you so much. Thank you all, and apologies for not being able to address all of your questions, but hopefully we'll be able to address them in future conversations. Thank you, take care, and see you soon.